So, Berto, chapter 6 in our deep dive of the psychology of Jodi Arias.
Incredible.
Hopefully our final chapter. I want to try to race through the final bits here. What do you say?
Let's do it.
This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor.
My name is Humberto Castañeda, and I make sure there's no moth on curtains.
So, the trial. Huge media circus. Huge media circus, January 2013. Tons of news coverage, tabloids, early social media coverage, crowds at the trial, death threats to all involved, lots of commentary that I watched a fair amount of. Dr. Drew, Nancy Grace were at their prime in this moment. Body language, quote unquote, experts.
This is 2013, you said?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
January. Video footage of her having pleasant small talk with a CBS interviewer. You know, all this just salacious footage. You know, did you see that clip? I think you did.
Yes. Yeah.
And
where she's putting the makeup on and all this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. She doesn't realize that she's being recorded, or she doesn't realize they might use it.
Yeah.
But she's being very pleasant, just like she would when she was being interrogated.
Yeah.
She's acting like she's an actress in a movie,
right?
That a fun rom-com. You know, she just has this really pleasant demeanor and kind of shooting the shit with the interviewer, like, "Oh, how are you doing? Oh, that's fun. What did you do today?"
Yeah. Literally like she's an actress and they're about to interview her.
Yeah. Working the crowd, trying to be nice to the camera people. Why do you think she was doing this?
A couple of thoughts. One is that she has narcissism to a degree, which is like the high order bit in this situation is that I'm getting a lot of attention, and I'm going to own it because I do deserve this attention. That's one. The other one is, again, to, in her mind, try to appear innocent, and that somehow translates in her mind to, you know, if I'm just chill and appear like a very nice person, that probably is what an innocent person would do right now. It wouldn't be stress and desperation that you can't believe it's gotten to this point where you're on trial for your life for something you didn't do.
Right.
No, it can't be that.
Yeah, I think a lot of arrows are pointing that direction. The more we talk about it, the more I think those are the top two hypotheses that could have both been present. The one in that due to relational traumas, she developed at least some narcissistic personality traits. I don't think she had full-blown narcissism, which I'll get into later, because she didn't show any of the classic signs. But this notion of self-grandiosity and self-centeredness and a pleasure in being paid attention to.
Yeah.
And if you're not getting attention, then you'll take any attention you can get. And also, as another part of this is this notion of like, I'm special, I'm lovely, I'm charming, and everyone's going to love me because I'm me.
Right.
Ted Bundy, and it's not that much of a strange parallel, when he was on trial and there was all this media coverage, he also was very charming and seemed very confident in himself.
That's right.
And would face the cameras just full on, just like, "Hello, cameras, how are you?" So I think that was a possible factor. Another, as you mentioned, is this weird notion that I think developed when she was younger, that if she played like the innocent, naive girl next door,
right,
that she would get away with it.
Yeah.
That seems to be a theme through a lot of her behavior. There's a lot of evidence that was released to the public, and all the news coverage was pouring over it. This is the early days of Twitter and Facebook. So you have all the pictures of the murder and of the body. You got her diary is poured over, his blog is poured over, all these posts and all these theories. The police questioning Jodi was eventually released. So just a lot of discussion online. One could argue the very first online, her and Casey Anthony maybe, the very first social media era trials of the century kind of thing. So getting into the details of the trial. So we've already gone over this, but her defense is that she eventually switched to a story that she killed him in self-defense.
Right.
And that he had a history of abusing her, and that led up to her snapping or believing that she was going to get killed, so she had to strike back, and claimed it wasn't premeditated at all. And she claims that she doesn't remember any of this because of PTSD trauma fog, which we'll get into more later, meaning that she, I think, claims that she doesn't remember anything from the point in which she started to kill him. And perhaps hours later, that whole span of time, she doesn't remember a single thing.
Which again, in the last episode, we did the what if. But that's the thing of like, it would have actually been better for her case had she had this thought from the start to not do any of the other weird cover-up stuff. Just actually drive there, and then the claim would be like, yeah, well, he was always abusive. He finally was trying to kill me. I had to defend myself.
Right. Interesting. And
just skip all the other stuff.
Right. Because if it's self-defense, then why did you rent a car?
Right, all that.
Why did you lie?
Yeah.
Why did you have a gas can? Why was your house burgled? Why didn't you tell anyone? So, yeah. Now, she admitted on the stand, by the way, that she did in fact kill him. She did stab him and slit his throat and shot him in the head. The prosecutor was very effective at getting her to make those statements. Yeah. Did you stab him 27 times? And at first she's hemming and hawing, but
it depends on what the definition of the word stab is.
but the prosecutor, he would corner her and because she's on the stand for 18 days.
Right.
And he very effectively got her to say, yes, I did kill him. Which wasn't necessarily in question, but hearing her admit to it was chilling.
Yeah.
Okay, so she made several claims, and I've categorized them into 3 different categories. Number 1 is that she claims she killed him in self-defense after he attacked her, and she claims that he attacked her because she dropped the camera. Because by this point, 2 years after the murder, actually this is 5 years after the murder. But I think 2 years after the murder was when she started to tell this story. She had seen the pictures because all of the evidence had been disclosed. She has access. So she starts to incorporate this notion of like, oh, well, I dropped the camera.
And since he was prone to his rages and his attacks.
He attacked me while he was in the shower. And then she claimed that she tried to fend him off, but then she ran into a closet and he came after her. And then she looked up in the closet and she miraculously, there was this 25 caliber handgun.
Right.
Coincidentally, a very rare gun, but coincidentally, the same one that was stolen from her house a week earlier. And coincidentally, she doesn't know where it is because she has PTSD fog.
Which again, it's like, no, of course I had to take a gun. I didn't know what else to do because I was so afraid for my life in those days. You don't understand. I went over there. Part of me thought I was going to die, but I loved him so much. And, blah, 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 blah.
But she claims she ran into the closet. She looks up. She sees the gun. She pulls it down. She shoots him. He is now not quite dead. He's still attacking her. Right. She finds a knife and starts stabbing him. And eventually she kills him. That's her story. There's more detail there, but that's the main story. So that's number 1 claim. The number 2 claim is that he was abusive and volatile. So one incident that she talks about is she said that Travis shook her, was shaking her, saying, "I'm fucking sick of you," then began screaming at her, after which he body slammed her on the floor at the foot of the bed and was taunting her, saying, "Don't act like that hurts," before he called her a B word and kicked her in the ribs. Jodi said that he went to kick me again, but I put up my hand, and in court she held up her left hand, showing that her ring finger was crooked. So this was evidence that she had defended herself from him kicking her. She there's a lot more elaboration there. And she claimed that he cheated on her, that he gave her low self-esteem, and that Travis had extreme mood swings. This would all be refuted by everyone else. Yeah. And there was not a single person who could really corroborate what she said.
And by the way, just like a note, and this is just hard to say and follow through with, but it just doesn't help if you're going through something like this for real, right? To spend 5 years lying and telling completely different stories, because then it just makes it hard to believe anything. Yeah. It's one of those things. So at this point, it's just like what we talked about with Casey, there's so many things that might have been true.
Right. Yeah. Along these lines, it's possible that this story is actually true. Although
she really did get abused. He kicked her, all these things.
Yeah, it's possible. It's also possible that he was violent with her because she was stalking him and slashing his tires and breaking into his house and sleeping in his bed while he wasn't home and trying to terrify the woman that he's dating and maybe threatening with blackmail or who knows.
Yeah.
Doesn't justify him being violent with her, but you can imagine her stalking him, showing up at his house, him saying, "Will you get out?" I mean, you could absolutely imagine this. And she starts to get physical with him, and he's like, "No," and takes her and slams her onto the ground. We don't know. It's also possible that there was never any violence between the two of them. I mean, there wasn't any other evidence of that. And I believe in her diary, which would have been another thing she could have done to help her case.
Things, yes.
But I believe in her diary, there wasn't any direct indication. And it seemed like her diary was a pretty fair representation of what she was going through. And if she were being abused, it would be very consistent that she would have included those details. But if she's going through an idealization phase with him, it's possible that she couldn't acknowledge that even to her. I don't know. But certainly there's not evidence that he attacked her and she killed him out of self-defense. Again, particularly given all the premeditation evidence. Yeah. Right. The third claim was that he was a pedophile, which seemingly came out of nowhere, but it was a theme. And you can imagine, Berto, in 2030, you can imagine today, but particularly, I don't know, maybe we still live in that era where if you're trying to get away with something, particularly if you're a woman, and I most of the time, the vast majority of the time, when anyone, and might we even say, well, really anyone, women included, when they make claims of abuse and sexual assault, the vast, vast majority of the time, this is the tip of the iceberg in terms of what the perpetrator has actually done. Right. So I want to be clear about that. And you could imagine if someone's trying to get away with something, that they know that what gets sympathy and what gets people to automatically believe you, because there's a movement to always believe, particularly in today's era, which is a pendulum swinging in the right direction, but maybe not. We don't go all that direction, but we try to emphasize, look, let's stop victim blaming, let's stop never believing women, that kind of thing. But you can imagine that Jodi Arias in early teens, 20 teens, coming up with this belief that if she's going to get away with it, she can pull on the heartstrings of the public and the jury.
If you hurt kids, I mean, that's never looked upon fondly, right?
Right. Pedophilia and domestic violence, intimate partner violence. You could absolutely imagine that she believed narcissistically that this would work, right? So on the stand, and I believe she's the only one to give testimony around any kind of pedophilic notion or
and
behavior.
She claimed that there was images on his computer.
Yeah.
They never found those.
Right.
And then there was that one recording was it recorded? Yeah, I think it was recorded, where he said, "Oh, you're making sounds like you're a 12-year-old having her first orgasm." Yeah.
So this is a pretty shocking bit of audio that I subjected myself, and clearly you did too. Yeah. This is one of the phone sex sessions that they played in court. Just imagine this, that Jodi Arias is on the stand and the jury's sitting there and the audience and the lawyers and the judge, and we're listening on a pretty loud PA system. Mm-hmm. Jodi having the longest, loudest orgasm.
Right. Which the prosecutor later described like cat squealing. Or
yeah. When you heard that, did it sound authentic? It's hard to tell, of course, but
it was weird. What I was going through in my mind was like just how the context is so horrific, right? Because normally if you're watching a movie or something and there's like a sex scene, there's that part of your brain that's like, ooh, it's a sexy sex scene, right? But that part of my brain was short-circuiting because it was like,
well, I hope so.
This is so horrific.
Well, because she murders him later.
Exactly. And so because of that, I didn't really give it much thought about authenticity or anything, other than just that her being the one recording it made me doubt like why this was being recorded.
Yeah. In the audio, he's talking about how he's enjoying it. Right. And after she's done, he says this phrase, and she doesn't know what he's saying. She says, "What do you say?" And he says, "It sounds like a 12-year-old girl having her first orgasm." Right. So that is, a tiny little yellow flag indication of something. But, there's a lot of other things it could be. Yeah. People have fantasies of a lot of different sort. Now, I don't know if we want to go down this road in this episode, but let me just say this, that someone could say such a thing and even have a fantasy about that and have zero motivation and desire to have sex with a minor.
Right. Wait, now, and the other thing is that obviously from the defense perspective, what they're trying to do is get a couple jurors to be like, oh, but he was a pedophile, right?
Right. Or he might have been a pedophile.
He might have been. But in reality, of course, if you just looked at it at the law impartially, you're like, well, that still doesn't give you the right to murder him.
Right.
You know? But it's interesting that it's presented that way. Like, well, I mean, he was a pedophile.
Yeah, I mean, Occam's razor, he didn't have an attraction to children, and she was cherry picking. The rest of her testimony, which could have been partially true, but could have just been completely made up because she made up a lot of things, obviously, were like one of the major details is she said that he wanted her to dress up like Spider-Man during sex. And then she also, and so when they're questioning her, it's like, well, so what does that say? And then she said, well, he was trying to get her to look like a boy that he liked who also dressed up like Spider-Man at some point. Mm-hmm. So is that possible? Yeah. But what's the likelihood that it happened and there's another explanation, or it never happened?
And again, it still doesn't justify you murdering him.
Right. Yeah. Also, she testified that Travis wanted her to dress like Little Red Riding Hood while she was tied to a tree.
Yeah, Little Red Riding Hood is probably one of the most common Halloween, sexy Little Red Riding Hood.
Right.
It's a very common Halloween outfit.
Okay, so the evidence presented in the trial, and there was a lot, and I think the trial took months, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, she was on the stand for 18 days, which I think translates to like a full month in and of itself, right? The evidence at the murder scene definitely does not support a self-defense narrative, which we could go over line by line, but just know that there was a lot of evidence that it was not self-defense. And the only evidence that he was abusive was from her account. Yeah. In opposition to this, several people, including former girlfriends, testified that he was never abusive, he was never aggressive. Right. Text messages and her diary, I believe, never referred to any violence between the two of them. And they had every text message, every email that they could look at. You would think, now not always, sometimes when you're a victim, you don't bring it up because you worry about being abused, but you would imagine that there might be some mention of something, right?
I'm sorry about abusive language from him, right?
Well, we'll actually get into that in a second. Plus, they were broken up, and she kept stalking him. Right. So she claims he was abusive, and he was a terror, and that eventually led up to her snapping and killing him. And yet he broke up with her. Yeah,
and moved that's to a different state, which normally you could say, well, yeah, because he was abusive. Okay. But now she's living in a different state.
They broke up when they were in different states. Right. After they're broken up, as I think you're getting to, she moves to be near him. Exactly. She begs him to work.
Now, there's a different narrative, of course, which you could say if she's really a victim, you never know how a victim is going. Sometimes it's really hard to get someone out of abusive relationships and blah, blah, blah. But
it doesn't fit the profile.
It doesn't fit the profile.
Yeah. If she were a victim who was gaslit or was terrified of opposing him, he would have a lot more overt attempts to say, you can't date other people, you need to be with me, that kind of thing.
And then again, if you're terrified because of this abusive relationship and you live states away and you are surreptitiously driving multiple states over to see them in a rented car, covering your tracks, now you still have all of that to explain.
Right. So her testimony, big surprise, was not convincing, and she contradicted herself a lot on the stand because she was saying a lot of things, and the prosecutor was very good at questioning her and there were and cornering her.
Yeah, several moments where she would say something like, he would say, well, what was going through your mind? It's like, well, I was just confused, as an example. And then some amount of time later, same interrogation, he's like, well, so you were confused. And she's like, well, I wouldn't call it that. And he's like, well, you said you were confused. No, I wouldn't say I was confused, but you said you were confused. And like they get into these back and forths.
Yeah.
And she was trying to be like hyper pedantic about words and about what she did. And this was driving him nuts.
Yeah. And we'll get into him in a second. She also said at first he convinced, the beginning of the relationship, that he convinced her to have anal sex. She said that Travis believed that anal sex was okay with God and that other Mormons also would have anal sex in lieu of having premarital P and V sex. And she said that they eventually switched from anal to intercourse, P and V, but less often, as evidence that he was abusive. He was trying to coerce her, which could be true. It also could be true that he did try to channel their sexual activities towards things that he believed to be not a sin, which we've been over, I think, in chapter 2, because it is a common thing. It's not universal, of course, but many people who adhere to religions that say you can't have premarital sex in today's world will actually say, well, anal sex isn't procreative, so let's do that. So it's possible, but it's hard to know if that was abusively administered from him or he was just saying, hey, what do you think about this? We just don't. So the prosecutor, Juan Martinez, lead prosecutor, and if you've never seen footage of the trial, just watching him go after, just type in on YouTube, like Jodi Arias trial, Juan Martinez highlights, because it's interesting. On one hand, he does a fantastic job, according to me, and I'm not a legal expert. I mean, he did, quote unquote, win the case, but he does a really great job. He seems very on the ball. He's very energetic. He's very convincing, very focused. He's able to dismantle a lot of, it's sort of like if you watch the Depp Heard trial. I can't remember the woman's name that was on the Johnny Depp side, but she became an internet star overnight because she was very calculating and arguably better than Juan Martinez, because there were times when Martinez
she's also very attractive, so I think she got a lot of notoriety for that too.
Okay, but she was so competent, like but the internet. But also she was very competent. Like I would imagine that even if she wasn't an attractive woman, that she would be lauded because of the energy around the case and also just because of the way she handled herself. And Martinez was both very impressive and very effective, and at the same time would shoot himself in the foot, I think, because he was losing his temper.
Yeah, because I think it was a mix of, in his mind, he's like, okay, I need to make the jurors see what we're dealing with here. But then he would occasionally forget the plot a little bit and get so irritated by her for real.
Or whoever. He'd get irritated by a lot of people.
Yeah. And it's like, no, you need to chill a little bit. Because then what you don't want is the jury to start feeling like, ooh, he's being bullyish.
Right. So there's one moment when he's questioning Jodi Arias on the stand, and she's talking about how she wanted to kill herself.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of evidence that was accurate. It's in her diary. It fits with the diagnoses that were being presented by the prosecution. And yet for the prosecutor, Juan Martinez, I think he was motivated to try to dismantle that claim that she was suicidal, because he, in this very short-sighted point of view, believed that the jury would either have sympathy for her because she thought about suicide, or that the jury would think if she were suicidal, that's a result of potential abuse from Travis and would support. So, in I think a very short-sighted manner, really tried to highlight the fact that she was claiming she was suicidal. Again, even though there's tons of evidence that was true, and it doesn't. It's not a stretch to imagine someone that was suffering that much emotionally and stalking him and so desperate to get him back that one might have those kinds of thoughts when they feel like there's no way out of the emotional turmoil. But he starts to go after her, and then he asks her, well, why didn't you do it? Why didn't you do it? And she says, well, because I started to cut myself to kill myself, but then it hurt, so I stopped. And as a expert, that will happen. Someone can have a lot of motivation to kill themselves, and when they actually, the research will show that people who attempt and complete, they not only have to have the motivation to kill themselves, but they also have to have the means to do so, and they also have to have the resolve to overcome your natural instinct to survive. Right. So you need to have all those things in place, and you can have a lot of motivation, you can have a very firm plan, a very firm method that you have before you And there are a lot of people that will get right up to the gate and they just can't open it because it's so overwhelming. Now, by the way, people, when people are at that point, if we can get them support, get them the treatment that they need, get them, to be with other people and feel supported and feel loved and feel accepted, they can get through that point. So I just want to remind that. But so Martinez starts to go after her, and he says to her, she's saying, well, I stopped because
it hurt.
It hurt.
Yeah.
And then he says, immediately just screaming at her, when you stabbed Mr. Alexander, do you think that hurt?
Right.
Completely out of nowhere.
Right.
Just, it was like,
so because what
Jesus Christ,
what he could have done, and you can see the difference. His closing 3-hour monologue is a masterpiece because he's not contending with her directly. So he's not losing his temper. It's very measured. But yes, when he's going back and forth, because what he could have done is he could have actually just let that linger and say, so you stopped because trying to stab yourself was very painful. How deep do you think you went? And let the jurors hear that and put their own conclusion there instead of that. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But he was actually he really obviously didn't like her, and he was obviously really getting upset.
Yeah, which is normal.
Yeah.
For better, for worse.
Yeah.
But I think he'd seen too many movies about court cases because those kinds of statements are said in movie depiction.
Did you order the code stab?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so the evidence that was presented that it was not only murder and not self-defense, but it was also premeditated because they weren't just going for murder; they were going for first-degree premeditated, which carries with it the death sentence in potential death sentence in that state, or maybe even anyway. Point is potential death sentence, which is what the prosecutor and the family were rooting for, and they're premeditated. So what are all the indications of premeditation?
In this case specifically.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I would say the stealing the gun, getting the gas cans, renting a car in a different city, turning off the cell phone, lying to her friends about where she was going, and then turning her cell phone back when she's back in a different area, and then placing that call, even though that's post meditation. But it was like, I don't know. I would add all these things up.
Yeah. I don't know.
That was kind of a weird one. So
yeah, but you could say circumstantially
part of the plan.
That again, if it was an impulsive act, why would you make that call afterwards?
Right.
That seems like that was your plan to do that afterwards. Yeah. Anyway. Another, and you gave a lot of the details I have in my notes. Another is that when she first arrived at the rental facility, they offered her a car,
right?
But it was red,
right? And she said, "Yeah, the cops stop the red cars more often."
And so they gave her a white one,
right?
Presumably because it'll stick out.
Yeah.
If it was red.
I remember. You remember this, right? Like when I was learning how to drive, didn't you? They used to tell you all this.
Oh yeah.
All the time, like, oh, if you drive a red car, you'll get a speeding ticket.
Oh yeah, I bought a red car, or I leased a red car a bit ago. And do you remember my red Accord? It was I really liked it. Anyway, I didn't have it for that long, but everyone would tell me, they pull you over, and I'm just like, one, is that necessarily true? And
so there's a lot of red cars on the road.
and two, like how much do you think I'm breaking the law?
Yeah.
And three, I've lived in Seattle for 30 years now.
Yeah.
I have seen, I'm not even joking, probably a total of twice in my life in the city limits of Seattle where there's a cop who is, using the radar gun.
Yeah.
You head out to the suburbs, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
But in the city, particularly when I live downtown, you would never see a cop downtown Seattle using a radar gun. So, I'm just going to take a guess and say that, speeding tickets are not.
But she did bring that up to the rental place.
Yeah. Another is that she took the license plates off her car.
Oh, I forgot, of course.
Why would you take the license plates?
And then she put them back on.
Right.
Which again, even though it's post, it shows like that was a thing. That was on purpose.
Right. That was the plan. Take them off and before you enter the town and then leave the town, put them back on. Yeah. Another thing is that she dyed her hair brown.
Right. The hair change.
Now, that's circumstantial, but
you just add them all up.
Yeah, you add them all up. So there's a lot of detail indicating premeditation. Okay, so let's take a break. And when we get back, let's go into detail on the psychological experts. And so I have a lot of notes on the testimony from the psychological experts, a lot of interesting detail, but the rest of the episode is just going to be for patrons of the podcast to reward them for supporting us and giving me literally the ability to do this and spend all this time and effort on this. So if you want to hear the rest of this episode, become a patron of the podcast, do it now.
Do it.